Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Ella Rooms, and I am a junior studying political science and psychology with a minor in dance. Across campus, I am a political researcher and peer mentor, a member of the University Honors Program, and involved with in university theater, and am a member of Delta 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 National Women's Fraternity. In addition, I am very proud to serve as a discussion group coordinator and am a member of the Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities throughout their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs, networking with our special guests, and professional development opportunities. Additionally, this summer I had the opportunity to intern with Congressman Jake LaTurner as a direct result of the experience and involvement I've had at the Dole Institute. If you are a student and would like to join the Student Advisory Board, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with the student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you are a part of our virtual audience, you may submit questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion about important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming Director Audrey Coleman.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute. It's so great to see you here again as we kick off our fall season of our discussion groups. And this season, we're having not one series, but two series. So this is really special. Two series featuring 3 different invited Dole Fellows. And before we get started today, I want to be sure and recognize our team of discussion group coordinators, including Ella, who you just met, Braden Bangalin, and Jacob McCarty. You're going to do a great job. Already these students have been producing these events by supporting logistics, by getting involved in program development, and assisting our fellows. So great job, students, and great job to Sarah Stacy, who coordinates and leads that effort. Last fall, I had the honor of participating in a conference in DC hosted by the former members of Congress at the invitation of Director Pete Weiklein. And I was so fortunate to be in attendance at that conference with our Board of Advisors emeritus member, Congressman Dan Glickman, among many others of his congressional colleagues, former members, and leaders of national-facing organizations like the Dole Institute, which also promote values like bipartisanship and constructive dialogue. One theme that we discussed last November was the importance of taking every opportunity to model the kind of bipartisan leadership we'd like to see, which brings us to our series this fall, Congress in the 21st Century. So I want to be sure and thank Pete and the FMC team for connecting us to former members Sherry Bustos and Luke Messer, and thank you to our friend Edward Riley for his financial support that made their visits possible. Plan to join us again here on October 30th, and again after the election on November 13th for second and third installments of this conversation at 4 o'clock on Wednesdays. Before I introduce Representatives Bustos and Messer, let me invite you to make plans to join us with our third fall fellow, Jonathan Shorman, who's the lead political reporter for the Kansas City Star. He'll start his series next Wednesday here at September 25th at 4 p.m. So make plans to join us again next week. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our 2 guests this afternoon. Congresswoman Sherry Bustos served Illinois' 17th District for 5 terms from 2013 to 2023. During that time, and among other leadership roles, she served as chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee and co-chair of the House Democratic Steering Committee. Before her election to Congress, Bustos was a journalist and vice president of corporate communications for a multi-state system. She's currently a partner at DC's Mercury Public Affairs. Congressman Luke Messer served Indiana's 6th District for 3 terms from 2013 to 2019. His tenure included leadership as chair of the House Republican Policy Committee and service on the House Committees for Financial Services, Education and the Workforce, Budget, and Foreign Affairs. Today, Messer is chair of the nonprofit Indiana Business Health Collaborative and a partner at Bose McKinney & Evans LLP and Bose Public Affairs Group. Please join me in welcoming and expressing thanks to these congressional leaders for serving as Dole Fellows with us this fall and hosting these important conversations as colleagues here at the Dole Institute. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Audrey.
Thank you.
Kick it off, Lou.
So we just get started, right? Well, first I want to thank the Dole Institute for giving us the opportunity to be here. When asked to be a part of this, there were really two reasons I said yes. One, my great respect for Bob and Elizabeth Dole, and my respect for my friend Sherry when I knew there would be the opportunity for us to be together. I have to tell you, I didn't really know Bob and Elizabeth Dole well, but I did meet them multiple times. The last time that I met them was at the World War II Memorial on a Saturday morning, greeting a flight of World War II veterans from my district that happened to be in town, and I know he was there pretty religiously greeting folks and being a part of this sort of amazing moment in their life when they got to see their service honored. And we thought it'd be kind of nice here to just kind of have a little bit of a dialogue. Instead of standing up here and give speeches at each other, we'd sort of talk to you about kind of who we are. And so with that, I'm going to kind of kick off and say to Sherry, you know, it's interesting to remember that members of Congress are people too. They came from someplace, right? So we thought we'd kind of start.
Most.
But so I thought I'd sort of start with that. Like, tell us about where you grew up. Was politics a part of your life when you were growing up?
Yeah, and I'll throw the same question back to you. So we would really like to get to know you, and please consider this a dialogue. I know we're going to open it up for questions at the end here, but we're Midwesterners. And you're thinking, okay, this woman's from Illinois, from Indiana. What in the heck are we doing here in Kansas? And but let us tell you a little bit about ourselves, and hopefully that will spark some discussion. I just left Congress a year and 3/4 ago, so pretty fresh out of Congress. And we can talk a little bit about what is Congress really like, what goes on behind the scenes. I am a Democrat from a Trump district. That is pretty unusual, so we can talk a little bit about that. But especially for the younger people here, we did want to talk a little bit about how we entered politics, what's our background, et cetera. Audrey talked a little bit about my professional background. I was a journalist for 17 years. I ran corporate communications for a multi-state health system for 10 years, and then I ran for Congress. So how did I get to that? I've been around politics pretty much my whole life. But never thought I would run for office. I never thought I would run for office. I was raised in really a middle-class family. My father grew up on a hog farm in the eastern part of Illinois, almost on the Indiana line. Luke and I were talking about that before. His father, a hog farmer, but he was also in the state legislature. My grandpa served a whole one term in the state legislature, a Democrat from a very Republican county. And the only reason he won was because it was a strange election in Illinois where you voted for multiple people. And so it was the only reason that he was elected, because again, a very Republican district, and he was a Democrat, ran the Farmers Union for the state of Illinois. My father was a journalist who wrote a 5-day-a-week political column. So to Orly in the back, can you imagine writing 5 days a week a political column? That's hard to come up with that, but that is what my dad did. When he couldn't afford to raise his 3 kids on a reporter salary, he left that, became a deputy press secretary for a governor of Illinois, then another governor, and then have you guys ever heard of Paul Simon? Probably the people who maybe are not quite as young have heard of Paul Simon, but he ended up being a U.S. Senator, ran for president. My dad was his chief of staff. And then, so I was around politics always. I ended up running for Congress because it was when there was an effort to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. So if you kind of think about that time, your connection to that would have been Kathleen Sebelius, right? So she was in charge of executing on the Affordable Care Act, which the rollout, if you remember, got a lot of heat because the rollout wasn't exactly good. My personal connection to that was this. I worked in healthcare, so I understood it pretty well. I knew we were on an unsustainable path on healthcare. Prices kept going up. Patient outcomes were not improving. They were, kind of like going like this. So I understood healthcare. My brother, my only brother, was on his deathbed, had a rare form of cancer, and died within a week of that 2010 election. The guy that was elected to represent my family and me ran on the platform of getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. My brother worked at a university, had health care, but it didn't cover the care that he needed to stay alive. So my mom and my dad and my sister and my husband and I, we all had to help pay his medical bills so his family wouldn't go bankrupt. All right? So that's the atmosphere in which I decided I'm going to run against this guy who's in Congress who wants to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, because while it's flawed, I think it's better than not having that. So that's why I ran. I beat him. It's hard to beat an incumbent member of Congress. We can talk about that a little bit. But I beat him. I've never lost an election in my life. Won 7 straight.
And I've lost many, so
we can talk about the lessons in that.
Why is that? It's talent's part of it. You'll see that.
No. I mean, there's a lot of things that involve it. But I won, and that's how I ended up in Congress. And so that's why I got involved in politics, how I got involved in politics, a little bit about my upbringing. And so, Luke, tell us about yours.
So, I mean, one, it's a great story. So just so I don't forget it, we came to office together in a unique time. It was often, you have these big elections like the 94 election or the 2008 election. I think it was, where there are big waves in one direction or another. Our class at that time, somewhat uniquely, was a big anti-incumbent wave, but there were 90 plus new members, but about split 50-40. I mean, instead of it being 85 of one party and 6 of the other, there were 40-some new Democrats and 50 some new Republicans that came in about that same time. And I think you've seen that anti-incumbent mood kind of spread, of course, from that moment into prior cycles. I grew up the son of a single-parent mom who worked at a factory in a little town called Greensburg, Indiana, which is an ag and manufacturing community in the southeastern part of the state. My district was 19 largely ag and manufacturing small towns. I mean, they're varying size. Muncie was 80,000. My hometown was 10,000. I even had one county in my district. I think the whole county had 6,000 people in it. Didn't even really think about it till sitting here and seeing the pictures. There are multiple ways where the state of Kansas has sort of impacted my political career in ways I hadn't even really thought much about. One of them was that even though I grew up in those relatively modest circumstances, my grandmother had been really involved in Dick Lugar getting elected mayor of Indianapolis. And so kind of like Sherry described in her family, I didn't know any fancy CEOs, and I didn't really even know the local doctors and lawyers all that well, but my family had this sort of idea that, people of integrity and ability could try to be in public office, and that probably I would say the thing that my grandparents, who both have since passed away, were proudest of in their entire life, beyond family, was the engagement they'd had as volunteers for Dick Lugar. They were part of a big crowd of people who did that. And then my local congressman was somebody else who worked with Bob Dole, which is a person named Lee Hamilton, who those of you a little older would know. And so, to be honest with you, the sort of WWF, World Wrestling Federation politics of today was not what I saw modeled when I was coming up. It was more folks like Dick Lugar and Lee Hamilton. And, I would say there's kind of the personal side of it and then sort of the more specific part that Sherry described. But, I looked, I knew I wasn't fast enough to be a professional athlete. I wasn't handsome enough and a good enough actor to be a professional actor. And I was really interested in politics. So I wasn't someone that told my friends and neighbors or my classmates I was going to run for office someday, but I was really interested in one way or another being a part of it, really from very young, in part because of those family connections. And then a second way that Kansas is a part of that is it is a true story that kind of the day I decided I was going to get involved in politics also happened in Kansas. I had worked in Wichita, Kansas at that time for Koch Industries. And Koch Industries is a fine place, but I was a corporate lawyer on their team. And I remember very distinctly on my 27th birthday in a bowling alley in Wichita, Kansas, true story, thinking to myself, I'm not going to be here a year from now. Okay, I'm going to go do something else. And so I kind of cataloged for myself, well, what are the things you could do? You know, and I went through that same thing. Well, I was really interested in basketball, but I was a 5'11" power forward, so my basketball career ended on the freshman B team. And I was, you know, interested in movies, but I had no background there. And I was at least a lawyer with a family background that had some, so I thought maybe I could do some politics. And I literally left my job in Wichita, Kansas, started handing out resumes, and pretty soon I was a staffer for a Congressman, Jimmy Duncan, from Knoxville, Tennessee. And then fast forward a period of time later, and not an undefeated record like Sherry here, and had run at a different time in my life when I was 30 against a person you might have heard of, Mike Pence, in an open seat primary. His career's worked out pretty well, so you probably see where that race went first time. Yeah, well, exactly.
Until it didn't.
But anyway, exactly. Which, by the way, part of politics too. Maybe that'll be in our next session. But I kind of came of age in a rural Indiana district that you might imagine had a very different response to Barack Obama. And so, you know, there was a lot of motivation among folks in those communities to go to Washington and stand up against, you know, what by today's terms seemed very tame debates, but at that time seemed like big debates changing America. And so that's sort of what inspired me to be here in that moment.
So, what I thought Congress would be like when we were first elected. Again, we were elected in 2012, both the same class, and you get to know your class pretty well. We were sworn in on January 3rd of 2013. What I thought Congress was going to be like and what it was like are two very, very different things.
Yes.
I don't know if that was the same for you. You want to talk a little bit about what you thought it would be, and then when you were actually elected, and when in our class of 2013, and kind of how it really is?
Yeah, and there's so many different directions that you could go with that. So let me start with something, because, you know, I was taught as a good-natured, we call them Hoosiers, but a Midwesterner, that you try to start with a positive. So what's one of the most positive things about your opportunity to serve in Congress? Well, I have on my wall, and now my home office, but in my entire time when I was in Congress, a letter sent from the local congressman of my district in the 1950s to my grandmother. And we found it in her drawer after she died, in a desk after she died. And so I kept it, not knowing, I wasn't in Congress yet, of course, but I kept it and I framed it. And the reason why was because I wanted everybody in our office to think about the fact that as we interact with people in this moment of their life, when they've got something really serious going on, that you're really touching people's lives. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I know we don't keep letters anymore, but think about what that means, right? That was important enough to my grandmother that it was in her desk, 50 years later, and now on my wall 70 years later. And you can, as a member, touch lives, right? Like if you have your team organized, and I know Ella was mentioned earlier that she worked in a district office. Well, one of the best ways to serve is in a district office, because that's where people reach out to you and say, hey, I need help with my Social Security check, or I'm having some, problem with a veteran's benefit, or I once had somebody who was had been arrested in Canada because they had accidentally crossed the border with a gun in there.
Oops.
And we had to help figure out, hey, this is not a terrorist, this person's fine person. We got to, we were able to track that down and make it happen. So that part's great. I think as Sherry and I could talk about in more detail, one of the hardest parts is that from the very beginning, you sort of get divided by party. And it makes it very difficult to have dialogues across the aisle in the way that you think would solve problems. And this kind of, a lot of these conversations, they kind of overlap with each other, different topics. But like one of the things that was sort of startling to me, it was very cool. But imagine when you're a newly elected member of Congress, one of the first things you get to do is they have a dinner for you in Statuary Hall. So how many of you here have been to the Capitol and seen like Statuary Hall, right? So amazing place. It's where they do the luncheon after the inaugural, right, every 4 years. And you're there, and it's like china and fancy forks and great food. And it's the kind of the first moment where you say, wow, I'm a member of Congress, and this is like a different deal, And but what would surprise you is that that's done. There's one night is a Democratic new member night of Congress, and the next is a Republican night. And the reason's this, it's not as nefarious as you might think. It's just that both leaders sort of agree, hey, trying to get these new votes for my leadership or speakership, it'd be kind of nice for me if I got to host these people, because this is going to be pretty cool and impressive, right? But the result of that is, even from the beginning, you're separated. Then you go off to caucuses that are separated, and you don't get very many opportunities. Now, our class, for reasons we could talk about, we did some events and some things to try to get to know each other personally, but some of the challenge in Washington is, because people don't live there anymore, they don't really know each other very well.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly the point worth making here and what can change. What I thought Congress would be like is I thought we would go to rooms together, talk about our legislative ideas, that we'd have Republicans and Democrats sitting elbow to elbow and say, I want this in this piece of legislation. What do you think? No, I don't really like that, but you know what? I'll accept that if you'll accept this. I really thought that was what was going to happen. The old smoke-filled rooms that you would hear about. Most people don't smoke anymore, but I just thought that's what it was going to be like. Totally opposite. To Luke's point, there's what's called new member orientation. So we have our election the first week of November, and before you're sworn in on that January 3rd, there's a 2-3 week period where we have this new member orientation. Luke talked about the dinner. Those are separate. After we're sworn in, the first overseas trip that typically new members of Congress take is to Israel. We don't do that together. It's Democrats go on one trip, Republicans go on another. So there's no reason that it needs to be that way. There really isn't. I understand Democrats having the caucus where we caucus together and Republicans having what they call the conferencing together. I understand that. But when it comes to the new member orientation, I think my suggestion for improvement would be almost all of that should be together.
It should. Well, and it used to be, when you saw the transition, but almost all the overseas Codels used to be bipartisan, but a lot of them now are a lot less bipartisan.
Yeah, and that first overseas trip, you really do bond. And actually, the bipartisan trips that you do go on, you really bond because you're away from Washington, D.C. You are in a foreign country. You are together in meetings with world leaders. And it really is a missed opportunity. Do any of you know that there is a congressional women's softball team? It is the one thing.
Yes.
That, and let me tell you the difference between did you play on the baseball team?
I didn't, for reasons I can tell you, but I probably wouldn't tell you in a public
All right. Well, so the men, this is like a gender difference too. For the women in the room, the women get this part of it right. So the men, there's been a congressional men's baseball team. They don't call it the men's baseball team. It's just called the baseball team. But they've played that game for 100 plus years. Mm-hmm. And it's always been Democrats against Republicans. And now they play at the Washington Nationals Major League Ballpark. They play under the lights. It's a really big deal. They raise money for charity and have raised a lot of money over the years. The women's team, and I have played all 10 years I was in office, other than the COVID year when we didn't have the game, but I've played on the team. I was the shortstop.
Which, by the way, means she was pretty good.
I know how to play. I was a college athlete. But our women's team, we played Democrats and Republicans on the same team. House members and senators. Sharice Davids, one of your congresswomen from Kansas, she's on the team.
Susan Brooks used to be.
Susan Brooks from Indiana was on the team. But if you look at our infield, we had Joni Ernst, Republican senator from Iowa, was the catcher. Martha Roby, Republican House member from Alabama, was the first baseman. Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Democrat House member from Florida, was the second baseman. I, a Democrat from Illinois, was the shortstop. Shelley Moore Capito, Republican senator from West Virginia, was the third baseman. The pitcher was Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat from New York. So that's the infield. But my point is, we played together. Our opponent was the Women's Washington Press Corps.
Something to unite against.
Yeah, it would. But so you show up at 7 a.m. 2 to 3 mornings a week for practice. You don't have any makeup on. Like, I wouldn't even comb my hair. I would brush my teeth, but we'd have our sweats on, and you get to know your fellow House member or senator in our rawest form. And we would talk about our families. We were forbidden to talk about politics. We did not talk about politics. We would talk about policy sometimes, legislation. And the reason I bring that up is because those are the kind of things that you really do need to do to get to know people as human beings, as opposed to somebody who's the enemy or somebody who's just across the aisle that is not your friend. And that really led to working on policy together. And I also, like I said, there is a gender difference in how we build relationships, and that's just one of the examples.
Well, and this was, it's interesting now because you see how people move on in their career, but I mentioned to you the fabric of how we came in 2012 and how it was a little bit different. And one of the things, that it was more 50-50. And so one of the things we did as a group was just try to make sure that we had meetings and gatherings together under the premise that it's harder to hate somebody that you actually know. So we did things from like having pizza at We to Pizza to have Bill Gates come in, and he talked about policies regarding immunizations and we did something. I remember going with Tulsi Gabbard and a group of people to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And when you know folks, most people are pretty decent, that you may not agree with them on a whole bunch of things, but they're pretty decent. But so I know this center is devoted to bipartisanship, and I know that most of us here, by the fact that you're here listening to a conversation about bipartisanship, probably think that that's a basically good thing. But talk a little bit about, Sherry was, we're two different kind of seats. Sherry, when she was there for at least most of your time, was in very much a swing seat. I was in a pretty partisan district. My district would have been almost a plus 15 to 20, depending on the year, and so it brings different pressures. But did your constituents want you to be bipartisan? Was there pressure to be bipartisan when you were in Congress?
Yeah, but that's more a reflection of the kind of district, right? I mean, so if at the top of your ballot, so let's look at the 2016 election. Does anybody remember who was on the ballot in 2016 for president? Okay, so it was Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, right? And so I could feel on the ground the politics changing. I mean, I could feel it. I could, in my conversations I would have with people, everything started to feel different. The district that I represented swung from an Obama district, so 4 years earlier, to a Trump district. It swung 17 points. It was one of the biggest swings in the nation. So think about that. I don't know, like, do you know any at swing point in your district that you represented? Like, and if it did, it was probably a point or two, right?
Yeah,
Which is more normal. But think about that, 17 points. So in 2016, I'm going to get to your question about the pressures. But so I won that year by 20 points. In the same year that it swung to Donald Trump by 17 points. So it was, so that message, so in other words, winning by 20 points to people who voted for Trump. So 1 in 5 voters voted for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket and then voted for me. I very much felt like I better make sure that I'm displaying the fact that I may be a Democrat, but I could easily lose this seat if I don't figure out how to get this right. And so, and I think we should talk about like day to day, what do you do at home? What did your day to day look like as a member of Congress in a Republican plus, what'd you say, 15?
Yeah.
15 district. What did my day to day look like in a district that voted for Donald Trump but then also voted for me?
So how did you win by 20 points when Donald Trump won your district? What made you unique that all, because many of your colleagues didn't.
No, think about also, did you guys switch, were there many congressional races in Kansas that switched, like incumbents lost at all? No? Did it go more Republican? Was 2016 a turning point in Kansas? No, she was 2018. Yeah, she came in 2018. 2018 was kind of a whole different cycle too.
Yeah.
A lot of brand new people who had never been involved in politics came in 2018. And we can talk a little bit about that as well. But so Luke, here's how I would answer that question. I went home every weekend. So whenever we weren't out in Washington, D.C., I was home. I worked every weekend. Like, it was kind of like, you better make sure that you're showing up. I have a media background, so I wanted to make sure that, let's say you're in Lawrence, Kansas, and you've got, how many people do we have in the room here? What do you want to say, 30-ish? Okay. You want more than just the 30 people in that room knowing that you were in town and you were talking about an issue of importance. So we were we would want to make sure that the media showed up. So thank you, Orly, for being here. Thank you to our media crew for being here, and those who are watching where we're streaming this, and we're going to open it up for questions. But so we would always amplify that. But I did 3 things that I think made a difference. Number one, I did, you remember how town halls got really, really nasty? Mm-hmm. You guys remember how, like, there was like a turning point where they got really nasty. I made a decision that I was going to do town halls, but I was going to do them in public libraries. Why? People don't get nasty at libraries. They don't get loud at libraries. And we had a lot of small town libraries. I had a very rural district, so we had a lot of small town libraries.
And
so
people follow rules in small towns.
They follow rules, and they don't get nasty. So that's where we did those. Number 2, I did something every Saturday that we called Supermarket Saturday. I would walk the aisles of the smallest of grocery stores to the bigger ones, and I would, no media was around. I would just have one staffer in case we had to follow up, but I'd say, hey, I'm Sherry. I represent you in this region in Congress. I'll be flying back out to D.C. on Monday. What do you want me to know? And then I would, I almost didn't have to do focus groups or polling any election cycle because that was a really good way to know what was on people's minds. Open-ended questions. And I did that every Saturday. And then the third thing, I did something, we called it Sherry on Shift, where I would job shadow people. And I did 120 of these over the years, but it was everything from changing street bulbs from 30 feet up in a cherry picker to mixing chemicals at a chemical shop to delivering UPS packages to sacking groceries, whatever it is. And they were mostly like kind of more blue collar jobs. And, like listening to people, shoulder to shoulder and but those things helped me, and it was a little bit different than a lot of folks did. But, talk about your time at...
Yeah, but see, what I think is, and you can tell, look, she's really, really talented and capable, right? So that, I think, helps. I think I've always said about Congress, and this is something I think I knew a little before I was in, but certainly learned while I was there, it's the highest level local office.
Yeah.
Like, people can know you, even in my 19 counties, at least by the transitive property, right? They may not have met me directly, but almost everybody met someone who knew me. And so I had a, different experience than Sherry, but similar in this way. I ran for the U.S. Senate and did not win, but I was outspent essentially 3-1, and all kinds of things were said about me that were not really consistent with my career and what I'd done. And I won all 19 counties that I represented by a lot. Why? Well, I just believe because our team and all the work they've done, and in those 19 counties, you could throw a lot of money at me, and it didn't really matter because the people in those counties knew me or knew people who knew me. And I think one of the things to sort of watch when you're judging members of Congress in particular is, are they from the place they represent? Right? And you're of your area. I was a small town kid from my district. I knew where all these different communities were. I knew what their team colors were. I knew what their nicknames were. And so I think when you have those qualities, ultimately most people are pretty fair-minded.
Yeah.
And they just want to know that they're represented well. I think the pressures in a a couple stories that come to mind when I think about, so what's it like to be in a more partisan district and some of the dynamics that Sherry described around the Trump race. I remember very distinctly about 6 weeks out from the primary where Donald Trump clinched his nomination in Indiana. You may not remember now, but if you remember that time, he clinched it very late. It was in May. Indiana's normally doesn't even matter anymore because it's been.
He hadn't picked Mike Pence as his running mate.
No, he had not. In fact, Mike Pence endorsed Ted Cruz in the primary, which ended up, the weirdness of politics, being almost a net plus for Pence when it came to getting picked. And Mike's a friend. Anyway, I remember seeing, there was an event, a breakfast event for me in my hometown, and it was all the parents of the kids I'd grown up with. But frankly, most of the kids I grew up with, if they went to college, didn't live in my hometown anymore. And those parents who were, 20 years older than I remembered them, all kind of also knew that their grandkids weren't coming back, and they were all for Trump. And it was just it was a sort of an epiphany to me that, oh, wow, the beginnings of what now, how many years later, 8-10 years later, we all realized that folks felt left behind, right? They felt like their leaders had kind of abandoned them, and you started to see that. A second, though, was this, and I've mentioned this story earlier. Just because you live in a partisan district doesn't mean that you can only do partisan things. And in fact, some of you may remember when Barack Obama drew a red line in Syria and said that, we can't use chemical weapons, and if we do, we have to respond. And frankly, most Republicans, I think in a somewhat unprincipled way, didn't support his position there. But the emails into my district and calls were, I kid you not, 3,000 to 3. Opposed to the president's position. But I had just been to Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu had spoken to me, and I was going to take this position. In fact, I ended up in a very small group of people in the White House. I didn't tell you that story because there was only like 10 of us at the time we were saying it. Well, anyway, I went to a little barn party of 400 people in my district, and I knew by the calls in that 4 of them in the room agreed with me on my position on Syria. But I started my speech by stepping to the podium and saying, great to be here, love you all. Remember last year when I told you that we must stand with Israel? And they all clapped and applauded. And I said, that's why I have to take this position on Syria. Let me tell you why. And I went on and had the description. Several of my Tea Party supporters came up to me afterwards, and they said, well, Messer, I know you're not doing this for politics, so, we may disagree on this, but we respect your position. And I think, there's a lot of challenges in the current world, and we can get into those in more detail, but some of it is a little bit of laziness. I mean, it's harder to do what Sherry did and go stand in a grocery store and get to know people and be your own walking focus group.
That's easy.
It's hard to stand in front of people and try to make the case and do it. But
are you an introvert?
No.
No. Okay. I mean,
Are you?
No, zero introversion in me. I mean, I love being around people, and again, I think my background as a reporter, I I actually would choose to ask questions as to answer them. Like, I want to ask each and every one of you a million questions. I'm thinking, what brought you here tonight? Like, I just have a million questions as I look around. And but no, I mean, that is not hard for me. That was like the enjoyable part of the job.
What was your least favorite part of being in Congress?
Oh gosh, actually, it involved more intra-party politics that I think were the hardest part. I'm a moderate Democrat, and that is not always easy. And I would be threatened to be primaried every election cycle. And so, look, I voted the way that I believed was the right way to vote, and that represented my district. Our titles are representative, but it's also our job description. And but so for me, it was that. And then I was on the floor on January 6th. I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask, but I think we have time for maybe this should be our last question, and then we can open it up for discussion if that's good. And then we're supposed to remind everybody for the purposes of this that after this question, we'll go to you guys for questions, but folks watching can go to Dole Questions at ku.edu if you want to send in any questions, okay? So that's for the audience out there. But I think one way to maybe enter into opening it up for questions, but Luke, from the time you went into office, when you were elected in 2012, and then you can even maybe go back to when you were in the state legislature, to the time you left elected office, what are the biggest changes? How did things change in that time? Because you go way back in your elected office.
I mean, there's a ton in it. I mean, I think, there's like really big ideas and then kind of more tactical things that I think make a big difference. I mean, one of the biggest changes, and I think it's dangerous for our republic, is the virtual death of local and state level media. When I first came into office, you were accountable for telling the truth. And frankly, the voters cared what the referee thought. So if you were called out for lying, that hurt you, particularly almost in some ways in your primary more than the general, where people were already becoming more partisan. Today, no referees. It's essentially whatever you can make up, if you can say it loud enough and you do it in a kind of clever way, you sort of can shape reality, and that's a big difference. Yeah. I think that, I mentioned to you people like Lee Hamilton and Dick Lugar. There's something, for all the great, it's great for our country, right, that the Cold War is over. It's great. I remember as a young kid, like going out, why we were walking to the sidewalk for a bomb drill, I don't know, but that's what we did, is we were sort of, the end of the Cold, thinking about like still in kind of Cold War in the 70s, thinking about those things. But I think there's something in the moment that we've kind of gotten cavalier about our politics in a way that, it's a little bit of, like a reality TV show or something like that kind of, I'm trying to be a star, so I'm running for office thing wasn't, a reality. I don't know. How about you? What things do you think?
Gosh, great point about the I don't want to say the death of local journalism, but gosh, it's in a bad place. Yeah. It's in a really bad place. That's a great point. Social media.
Yeah.
The age of disinformation. When I ran the political arm of House Democrats, we had to set up a unit for the first time in history, a disinformation unit to address foreign interference and also just the lies that would be online and how those were going to impact our candidates. And then, as I just alluded to very quickly, January 6th was just a real, that was for my family. I didn't run for re-election last cycle, and that was, for my family, that was the last straw for them. My husband at that time was the sheriff of our county. He was also an elected official. We have 3 sons, 3 daughters-in-law, and 3 grandkids. And we had a family meeting over Easter, and everybody except for one of my daughters-in-law said, you know what, there's other things you can do. By Washington standards, you're still young enough to have another career. By other standards, not. But and so we made a family decision that was going to be my last term in office. and made a decision that I wasn't going to run again. So, I mean, that was a pretty bad moment in our nation's history and for me on a personal level as well.
Yeah, I think that's, there's lots of things that you say to folks that you want them to understand, but I think it's easy for people to forget. We signed up for these jobs, we put our names on yard signs, but there's a whole lot of people around you that didn't, and the sacrifices they have to go through, I think, is one of the hardest parts of doing these jobs.
Yeah, it really is harder on our families, I think. Okay, so another reminder, if you have questions, dolequestions@ku.edu, and then we're going to open this up. Our wonderful students are passing around a microphone, so if you are here in our in-person audience, just, raise your hand, and then you'll get the mic, and we will answer any questions you have. And how does it work for people typing in questions? Does somebody read those then? Is that you, Sarah? Okay, all right, gotcha.
You mentioned social media. How much do you think that contributes to the complete ineffectiveness of our current Congress and House? It seems to be non-productive. It seems to be a lot of grandstanding, a lot of really poor information. I'm just curious how much you think that contributes and why we seem to have pivoted or turned into this circus rather than being productive and doing their job, essentially.
Well, there's a lot in that.
Go
You
ahead.
want to go
Go
first?
ahead, Liz.
No, it's great.
Yeah,
Look, I think it's a big challenge for all of us, right? We've all seen this little box just kind of kicks you back the very thing you want to hear, right? So it puts all of us in echo chambers. I used to say, people talk about, they want you to go out there and work and be bipartisan, but if you light your hair on fire and bark on the moon, they'll have you on national TV, and now on social media, you'll raise millions of dollars, and pretty soon they'll be saying, hey, have you thought about going to Iowa? We really need to see you at Iowa and New Hampshire, right? I mean, it's almost kind of the crazy path to get there. I think, of course, all these amazing communications abilities could also get the right information to people, possibly, right? So I don't want to be exceedingly pessimistic about it. I actually have I think there are major, and it's, we are in a university setting, so we could get in the weeds about it later, but I think there are some really major reforms in the way Congress operates that are as much a part of the problem as it is like social media. I mean, the reality is that, particularly in the House, the decision-making is so centralized and leadership-driven that an individual member has almost no ability to push the institution on real substance, but they can go bark at the moon, and they'll get on TV. And so it almost drives those people to somewhat rational behavior, which is the only way they can start to get noticed. So I think we do have, we've got societal challenges and institutional challenges before it changes.
So does anybody here raise your hand if you know the name Marjorie Taylor Greene? Okay. Social media and behavior. Raise your hand if you know Lauren Boebert. Again, social media.
I do feel like I have to
behavior.
say, do you know AOC? Right?
Okay,
I'm just
I'll
saying
let you ask that.
it's not one party or the other. I mean, there's folks on both sides.
Raise your hand if you know Brad Schneider.
We know Brad Schneider.
Right. So the point, like people who are just hard workers, not show-offs, not always playing to social media. There are more of those people than there are the people who their names, who play to social media, and in some cases, without naming names, but in some cases, aren't very good actors, and really aren't very good legislators. I think you might need the mic for the purposes of the cameras.
I think the problem, though, that at least my perception
is that these kind of bad actors who are out there making all this noise and spreading disinformation, just being crazy, seem to be influencing the public or the greater population more than they should, more than the people who are just there because they feel that it's their civic duty. There doesn't seem to be a lot of that anymore, or you don't see enough of it. There isn't enough exposure
Because the
of
media is
that.
not paying attention
Right.
to, as I said, Brad Schneider, or Nikki Budzinski, or Susan Brooks wasn't a household name, but was a great member from Indiana. So I actually think what needs to change is, I think money in politics is a huge problem. And the fact that you can have contributions and you don't even know where the dark money comes from. I think that is a huge problem. I think gerrymandering is a huge problem. I think, why can we not use AI to draw districts that are fair districts and don't lean heavily toward one party or another? I come from a blue state. I was in a swing district, but a presidential candidate's not going to pay attention to Illinois because they know it's going to go to the Democrat. Same thing with Kansas is going to go to the Republican. So I think like if we had more, as you look at the congressional districts, if they were more evenly balanced, I think we would also have more reasonable members. And I think the other thing is, and this is way too deep of a discussion for right now, but ranked choice voting, I think, is another thing that would lead to better politics.
Yeah, I'm not sure. She had me leaning her way on a few of those, but the last one I'm not such a big fan of. But what I would say is this: something that's very different about this social media stuff than even, now by the time Sherry left it was getting to be this way, but certainly when we came into office, I mean, a rank and file member, even if they were on Fox News, they weren't raising $6 million online.
Yeah.
You have these people now, I mean, they're almost unbeatable because of what they're raising on their comments.
And because of their districts.
Because they're districts in the gerrymandering. Now, look, here's a couple things, though, that I don't want to just be a Pollyanna about it, because I think there's a couple things that we all have to own instead of high-minded people who are willing to spend a Wednesday afternoon hanging out here, in the Dole Center talking about the future of America. It is a representative republic. And a lot of these folks are at least as much thermometer as thermostat, okay? Like, the people that sent them there are happy for him to be doing those things. And then frankly, heck, I once had somebody say to me when I was running in my Senate campaign, "You know what, Messer? I like you. You seem like a person of integrity. You're right on the issues. But you know what the problem with you is? You're not angry enough." Okay? So you know what I said? And I was so proud of my answer. I was like, "You know what, ma'am? I'm an old middle linebacker. Like, I get angry plenty, but I have to tell you, I've never looked back at a problem and said, I wish I'd just gotten more angry. I'd have solved that problem. So I'm really trying to focus on the problems and making them less angry." And that was a great answer, right? And then 6 weeks later, I get 30% of the vote and lose in the primary, right? So it's important to remember, right? I mean, it's a fine answer, and I'm not trying to sort of make fun of myself, but there's that reality. And then the second is, and I think gerrymandering is, it's certainly a problem. We need to figure out how to do it. I would just suggest it's not as easy to fix as it might have been 20 or 30 years ago, because frankly, we all live near people we agree with a lot more now. I mean, I'm not an expert in Kansas topography and demographics. I was with my friend Barbara earlier today, but my sense is Lawrence is a little different than Wichita, right? And so, we can have a district from Wichita to Lawrence to sort of make this thing more middle of the road, but that's a lot of ground to cover, right? So I do think it's important, and it is right. We ought to be trying to make them as less partisan as we can.
Yeah, but you're a red state with a Democratic governor. I mean, I think, that's, yeah. So, I think that's interesting. It makes your politics interesting.
But have you ever heard the old adage that you don't have to outrun the bear, just the camper standing next to you? And I would say I would say there are some unique stories in Kansas about why we have a few straight Democrat governors, I think, that have something to do with that adage.
That means like bad opponent?
Well, I can't say such a thing. I said all I was
Well,
going to say.
your opponent does matter. Your opponent does
You have to
matter.
you have to
Yeah,
beat the
in every
camper
election,
standing.
Yeah,
run
in
the
every
camp.
election, your opponent matters. Next question.
Hi. I'm curious, one of you mentioned about the leadership being extremely centralized, so that sparked my curiosity. When do you know what your vote is going to be on a particular piece of legislation? Like, are you sitting there and are you reading all of it? Or if you are reading any of it, which, like, you know, like what percentage or like what are you looking at to determine what your vote is going to be? And how often is it that an order just comes down from party leadership that says go this way or you get primaried?
So the incumbent member of Congress who I ran against claimed he read every word of every bill. Luke, is that possible?
No, you have a team. You have to have an entire team of people that help you do that. It's phone books.
But
and
I'm
phone
just
books.
saying, he claimed that,
Yeah.
because I forget what there was, you know, some argument about, did you even read the bill type of thing. We cannot physically read every bill. It is not possible. You would not have enough time. So as members of Congress, we are allowed to have 18 staff. We are capped at having 18 staff. Now that can include like 2 part-timers, and you can have interns on top of that as well. My district was pretty big, like Luke's. He had 19 counties, I had 14 counties. Did you have 3 offices at home? Or how many
I
district
had
offices did you
2
have?
offices at home.
Yeah, so he had 2 offices at home. I had 3 offices at home, and then our DC office. So among all of that, you can have 18 staff. Typically, the structure is you have a chief of staff, you have a legislative director, you have a communications director, and then on your legislative team, you have like some legislative assistants, somebody who handles your mail, that's called a legislative correspondent, et cetera. So they are kind of your first line of studying everything that comes into your office. How we would do it is every week when you were in session, you would fly in either on a Monday, and you'd be in session Monday through Thursday, or you'd fly in on a Tuesday and you'd be in session Tuesday through Friday. It was 4 days a week, with the other day meaning you would be back home theoretically and work. You'd have 1 weekday to work at home on things. So our staff would go through everything that we knew we were going to vote on that week. They would study all of that. And then on my fly-in day, my first meeting would be with our staff to talk about what the week ahead looked like. Who was going to be flying in and meeting with us? How many meetings did we have? Who were we going to meet with? What legislation were we going to vote on? But they would do that research. And my questions would typically be, you know, how about at home? How does this impact business at home, people at home, organizations at home? I would, again, representative, you represent your district back home. So that would be it. What groups or people were supporting it or not supporting it? What were we hearing from people at home? Were we getting emails? Were we getting letters? Were we getting calls? So you kind of look at all of that, and then they would make, and Luke, you can talk about how you guys did it, but they would make a recommendation. We recommend you vote no on this. We recommend you vote yes on this. And then we would have a discussion on it. And then a lot of times I would talk with our Illinois congressional delegation. You know, hey, what are you guys doing on this? Leadership would whip for us to vote for or against. Now, if I was going to go against leadership, and I did that, I would typically call our leader or our whip, and I'd say, I just want to let you know I'm not going to be able to be with you guys on this. And they would then try to change your mind, and sometimes they'd yell at you because you're not going to be with them, but you would explain why it was. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
That's how we did it. Luke,
Yeah,
you might have done it differently.
So I would, couple things. One, agreeing with virtually everything Sherry said, one of the things you do as a member is you create the prism, the philosophy, the sort of principles, the way your team's going to analyze this. And so part of like the conversation with my team would be, okay, if your recommendation is anything outside the norm of the sort of worldview we always talk about, help me explain why and why you think that's the case. Really, where leadership is so, when I say they're in charge more of what even gets a vote at all. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much, hey, you have to vote my way or the highway, but it's more like that bill's not even getting to the floor. Every time that there's an amendment, and I won't like bore you with the difference in state house rules versus congressional rules, but to speak generally this, if you're a member of the Kansas legislature and somebody brings a bill to the floor, they have to call it up on second reading under parliamentary rules. And when a bill comes up on second reading in a state house, every member can offer amendments. And what that means, right, is if you don't have half the body, your amendment gets voted down, but you can at least push the body and say, we're going to talk about this thing that I believe, right? As an individual member, it's when I say they barking at the moon on social media, unless you're the committee chair, it's really hard for you to have a chance to like call the question and sort of push the body. So it's really more that the speaker and their team decides, hey, this bill's even coming to the floor. And then only thing I'd supplement what Sherry said, it's been reformed even over time to more. I think now they have 48 hours notice or something, but you typically have multiple days before you would have a vote, and then amendments a little more like the day before, and your team would have an opportunity.
And that way
to
the
see it.
public knows also. So there's
Yeah.
time for input from the public.
Yeah.
Does that all make sense? Yeah.
And that would be, it's an interesting kind of quirk about what's changed. Like, it used to be, even when we first came in, everything wasn't all over the internet in ways that
Yeah.
the public couldn't really like examine it. Like, it wasn't in a practical way that they could read everything. And that's good that now they can. But the bad thing is that then you get these social media distortions of it. It's not even what it really is, and so they're getting all that clamor. And so they're yelling about an amendment or something when they may not even really know what it is.
Other questions? I see two hands raised.
Yeah, we'll get to both.
And there's one back there after her.
Hi there again. So
Hey.
nice to meet you, and thank you again for being here today and speaking with us. I interned on the Hill for Representative Davids this past spring, and I sort of got to know how members work with other members from their same state. And I think that we don't really advertise that very much, and especially coming from a red state with a Democratic governor and a Democratic representative, I wasn't aware of how much Representative Davids worked with, Representative LaTurner, Representative Mann, and Senator Moran, all Republicans. I was wondering if that was something you experienced in your states and your experience in Congress.
Yeah, I think it's important. Like Andre Carson from my state was somebody we'd sometimes work on issues for the city of Indianapolis, for example. And I think it is important to say out loud, I wish it was more like state legislatures. I used to say when I was a state legislator that, 80 to 90% of what we work on isn't really all that partisan. It's just you hear about the 10 or 15%. I think it used to be in Washington that at least half of it wasn't all that political. I'm not sure it's half anymore, is it? That we don't find some way to be. But there's certainly lots of, you talk about transportation or infrastructure or other topics where you have an opportunity to get together. And that's, I think, the other thing. I would say, on my final statement I made as a member, I said this and meant it. I didn't meet one person in Congress who I thought was trying to destroy America. I met plenty of people who I thought had bad ideas. I had some people who I probably didn't really want to go to dinner with, but I really didn't meet anybody who I thought was like purposefully doing the wrong thing. I think they maybe convinced themselves that some things were okay that weren't. And so that means, that you certainly find plenty of people you can work with.
Well, I think, now I don't know how many states do this, but in Illinois, and this goes back to the 1980s, the Illinois delegation would get together for monthly lunches.
They were good about that.
Did you guys do that in Kansas? Okay, so we're, even though we're a blue state, we have several Republican congressmen and women, and Senator Durbin, who is our senior senator, and he's in leadership, he's in Senate leadership, so he has an office over at the Capitol. So the lunch is typically in his office, and we all take turns paying for it. So in Illinois, we have 17 House members and 2 senators, so there's 19. So once every 19 months, you have to pay for the lunch. And we would talk, the whole agenda was about how can we work together for the good of the state of Illinois. And then once a year, the Chicago mayor would come in, because Chicago's the biggest city in Illinois, and talk about what he or she wanted us to be aware of. And yeah, so we did look for ways that we could work together. Now, interestingly, in my 5 terms in the House, because Senator Durbin would always host these, and we're, again, a blue state, fewer and fewer Republican congressmen would come to those, which was really a shame, because it was meant to be bipartisan, but over time, fewer and fewer showed up. And to the point where most of those, toward the latter part of my time in Congress, it was just the Democrats who would show up. But everybody was always invited, every single month.
And I you think about things that change. I went to both the Obama inaugural and the Trump inaugural and the Biden inaugural. There's not that many members that did all 3 of those. And I'm not talking about just Republican members. I mean, there were plenty of people that wouldn't, Democrats that wouldn't go to the other. And,
That is true.
I hope we get to talk about this later, but, if you ask me what can save the republic, I think it's civility and truth, and we can talk about what that means.
Yeah.
But both of those things are really important. You can't function
Well
as a
put.
republic if you don't have both.
Well put. I went to all the inaugurations too, and then, but I went to Trump's, and I remember people going, "Why are you going to that?" I'm like, he's our president. So.
Yeah, in fairness,
Yeah.
you would get heat back home for
Yeah.
going. I know this,
that-
we'll
yeah,
go
there's
to
a
you, but this
question
young
back
man
there.
had a question.
Thank you. And thanks for being here. I want to ask a different question to each of you, if it's okay. Ms. Bustos, you kind of mentioned it a little bit, like when you bulk your party leadership, like each time you get hit from both them and from some voters, and like being threatened with a primary. So, like, what do you tell these people? How do you answer? How do you approach that? Like, what do you say to people who say that you are like betraying the party or something like that by your actions? And to Mr. Messer, so you are a conservative member, and so sometimes, the compromise is associated only with moderate members. So it's interesting that you are there to speak on importance of compromise, and I wonder if you would agree that one of the important things is, like, even if you have conservative positions, is not to participate in like useless publicity stunts and like discuss policy. And if you do, I wanted to mention a specific instance when you spearheaded a letter to nominate Donald Trump for Nobel Peace Prize, which I would consider one of those publicity stunts. And like, do you? If no, why? If yes, why did you do that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. You go first, and
All right, so what would I tell people in my own party when they were on me about, if they would, you're not really a Democrat, or, why aren't you voting for this? Or I would have protesters outside my office. And I live along the Mississippi River, so right across the border is Iowa, where there's a Republican member of Congress over there. And my thought was, you're Democrats protesting outside of a Democrat's office. Why don't you cross the river and go over there? And then, that's, look, you just have to have belief in your voting record. And, I was true to my values, and I thought my votes were the right votes, and I believed in what I was voting for or voting against. And I thought it was I thought I was doing right by the district and right by my own values. And so, as long as you believe that, and you can sleep at night with your voting record and how you approached your job, everything else was okay. You kind of have to be strong. In politics, it is not for the faint of heart, on any given day, you have half the people who think you're fine and half the people who really don't like you too much. And you have to be okay with that, and that is just a regular part of your job. When anybody would threaten to primary me, I would just say, please, we live in a democracy. You are welcome to do that.
have you seen me play shortstop? I'm not afraid to compete.
No, I do. I love competition. But the funny thing is, I never was primaried. Other than in my very first race, it was a 6-way primary initially. Ended up being 3 people ended up dropping out, and it ended up being a 3-way primary. But after that very first race, I was never primaried, even though I'd be threatened all the time. So, look, I have a good sense of self. I have a healthy self-confidence, and, and I have pretty thick skin. I'm the youngest of, my brother and sister would constantly beat up, like physically and verbally, like, we were always fighting. So, I could stand it, so it was fine.
Yeah, I think if, whatever the challenges of being in Congress, you will leave with thick skin. I
Yeah,
guarantee you
have to.
that.
Yeah.
If you didn't have it when you entered, or you'll be pretty miserable. So I appreciate the sincerity of your question. And, look, I think Sherry said it well. You have to do the things that you believe are true, right? And it is a representative republic, right? And so you also represent a district, and you have to be consistent in ways that are true to what you believe with what they believe. So I mentioned to you, for example, the serious story where I stood with Barack Obama and stood up in a barn party. Ironically, I kid you not, on cue, the Tea Party person I mentioned to you who said, "Messer, I can't believe you have that position, but you're sure not doing for politics." He sent me an inappropriate GIF or meme or something about the election, right? Just, so I still have some contact with him.
He's got your cell.
And he would know that it's that I would think it was inappropriate. But regardless, so you have those relationships. And I mean, look, the district where I represented, they support Trump by a lot. So your question about the Nobel Peace Prize, I mean, what it was about specifically was what Donald Trump did between North and South Korea. And the reality is, like, you can like Donald Trump or not like Donald Trump, but here's the truth of what was happening in Korea before he came to office. None of them were talking to each other any. And he came to office, and they have much better dialogue today than they did before.
And love letters.
I don't know. Well, he in his own actions too. It's unconventional, but I will tell you, like, that's part of what you hear when you're out in, Red America is, I think, and this is where I think the president, frankly, he's not counseling for me, but he thinks that people love the chaos, and I think, frankly, they don't. There's a whole lot of people voting for him that wish there was a lot less chaos in the way he acts and tweets and talks, but they like a lot of his policies. So, why did I put that forward? Well, from a district where Donald Trump was very popular, and frankly, I believe on the subject matter that I talked about, that was appropriate. Yeah.
Do we need this to be the last question? I'm just looking at time. I know we're scheduled till 5:15, or do we have 2 hands raised still? Yes, I see one. And do we have any questions on that people have written in? No, okay, all right.
And we can do speed round answers. Our answers don't have to be as long.
Okay, so Mr. Messer, earlier you commented that we need to get back to civility and truth. How do we get there?
Look, I think, it's not easy, right? I have been racking my brain as I've moved on and transitioned to a different time in life of how I can be a better part of trying to contribute to that. There's not a lot of places where it's incented in the current culture. Like, I'm not aware of anyone that got elected this last cycle or the next cycle for doing either. I think the Dole Institute is an example of one of the places that can be a champion for that. But I have to tell you, I wish I had a better answer. I do think that part of the importance of groups like this, and it is, I mean, no kidding, trying what I've been trying to wrap my mind around is, I worry, 40 years ago, most folks, at least folks that entered public life, understood the need for both. And I think we've got to spend a lot of time and energy helping people understand that it's even necessary. I mean, I have to tell you, I've been shocked at, like, personal accusations at each other by both sides. I'm not, you can always say who started it in committee, that I'm convinced 6 or 7 years ago would have been shut down by chairman. Don't you think?
Yeah, but I'd like to throw the question back at you all.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
better.
You really want to ask former politicians how we're going to get to truth and civility? I mean, you brought up the point earlier, like, this is a democracy that we live in, thank God, but who we are electing, they're elected by the people. So I guess I'd throw that back. Anybody have great ideas on how we can get to truth and civility in America? I told you my answers earlier. I think get money out of politics, get gerrymandering fixed, and you don't like the ranked choice voting, but I think those two things would go a long way to make things a lot better. I mean, it is going to take structural changes. It's not going to happen without a lot of effort. It might be referenda that we're going to have to take a look at. It's going to take changes in our election laws.
Well, and I would tell you, and I want to get to our other question, and we can hang another minute or two, but part of truth, right, is the recognition that you have to continue to challenge your own beliefs. So I would say to you, look, I think McCain-Feingold was largely a disaster. It frankly had the reverse effect of what they were trying to accomplish, and it didn't work very well even before the Supreme Court opened up the rest of it. But I think there's little doubt that money in politics today is a mess.
Yep.
Now, it's really complicated and hard to fix, right? Because, make no mistake about it, you know who benefits if we take money out of politics? Famous people. So you think you got a lot of famous people now? You wait, everybody will be a professional athlete, somebody was an actor, because all the money that was spent raising their name ID, right, is like makes them, a perfect candidate compared to what would be. So that's just one example, but I think it's not easy to do, but we are going to have to do something about all the money in politics, that's for sure.
I'll ask my question, although I think you've kind of already answered it. But to follow up on what you said earlier about whether politicians are sort of a thermometer or a thermostat, I'm just curious if either of you ever had constituents who complimented or thanked your efforts at either working within the delegation or other bipartisan efforts, versus did you ever receive comments about, negative comments about bipartisanship or, efforts across the aisle? Because I think I know the answer, but I'd be interested in hearing what it actually is.
Well, again, our districts are very different, so it was applauded at home, and, I guess the ultimate test was, how does a Democrat win in a Trump district? So people applauded me for that. My worst election, interestingly, was after I was chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, because how I was viewed at home was that I was bipartisan, that I did work across the aisle, that almost every piece of legislation I introduced, I had a Republican on day one as a co-sponsor. And then all of a sudden, when you're running the political arm of House Democrats and you are viewed as hyper-partisan, it was off-brand. And it hurt my vote totals at home. So it seemed incongruent with how people saw me. As far as being, I mean, does that answer your question? I don't know if that answered it completely, but.
Well, and I think, look, there was always a difference. I mean, we talked about this earlier, I think maybe before we were in here. The challenge for somebody in a swing district is their primary can be just as liberal as the most liberal district, or just as conservative as the most conservative district, and then yet you have to sort of navigate that centrist part of it later. Look, I think it's an incredible honor to serve Congress, and the vast majority of people you deal with are good and decent to you, and thank you for your service. And this is where I sort of lament, like, if I probably being a little too candid here to tell you that I didn't expect to lose my Senate primary in 2018, and it took me a little while to get over it. I don't know that I'll ever completely get over it. But I am mostly over it, by the way. Nobody has to worry about me. Nobody has to worry about me. But like, I saw when I was in Congress that I could be a really conservative member and also be a little iconoclastic and like do what I thought was right and tell the people I represented that, and they would get it because they spent enough time around me and the people they knew were around me. You know, Sherry was in a district that, you know, she pulled 20 points ahead of Donald Trump or won by 20 points, Donald Trump won. Like individual members, if they're courageous enough and work hard enough, they can do the right thing. This system is not rigged in a way where you can't. And yet, right, when I tried to take that road show from my 19 counties to 92, where it was mostly money driven because they didn't have that much time to really get to know me, it didn't sell near as well. You know, and I could tell you in hindsight that, but I thought it was going to sell. That's why I ran. You know what I mean? I wouldn't have run if I thought it wasn't. And so that's kind of this challenge. And how that applies in congressional primaries is most people, when they get started today, right, everybody won't know them, right? And they have to kind of play that game. And it's you know, a real challenge. But, you know, also, I think it's not all it takes is some great leaders and some people that will work with them. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this republic that can't be fixed by everything that's been right for a couple hundred years. It's really not. I mean, our challenges are not, it is not, we do not, our challenges are not bigger than the challenges our country faced in the Civil War or in the depths of World War II.
God, I hope not.
You think?
No, I said I hope not.
Yeah.
I mean, that's had to be a horrible time in our
Those were
in our
challenging
nation's history, yeah.
times. Anyway, all right. What positive thing can we end on, Sherry?
You know what? That I think you hit on it. That better days are ahead. I mean, we're kind of going through a tough time in our nation. With social media hasn't helped, but you know it's still relatively new, and we're getting used to that. Really, if you looked at behind the scenes in Congress, most people are really good people. You don't hear about them because they're not making the headlines. They're not on the nightly news. They're not on Fox or MSNBC. But most people are really decent, and they're working hard, and they're there for the right reasons. The people that get a lot of attention for really bad behavior, they are the exception. They are the exception in Congress. So maybe that would make you feel a little bit better. You've got, Kansas has good people in elected office. You have a lot of really good people. And
So you've just left me with two quick thoughts.
Okay.
That one relates to Kansas. I hadn't thought of it. But do you believe that, and I mean, look, by the way, I'm a Republican, so I probably wouldn't have voted for them. But 16 years ago, nobody would have thought you had 3 state Democrat governors, right? 16 years ago in this state, no one would have thought that you would look out 16 years later and have 3 straight Democrat governors, right? Was it not straight? 3 straight women governors. Okay, so I'm sorry.
But all of us, we are even in history
Yeah.
in terms of just slightly more Republicans than Democrats.
Yeah, so I won't, again, you guys know, of course, a lot more about Kansas than me. So I will say this, when I lived here 25 years ago, I think that, wasn't that around the time Sam Brownback was getting elected? He was getting elected to the Senate, wasn't he? Pardon? Governor Graves. I don't know, I thought the state was awfully red at that time. But anyway, things changed. That's kind of my broader point. That's what I wanted to make, and I didn't make it very well, so I apologize. But is that
Well,
things
tried.
change. Things seem like they can't change, and they change.
And the power's in your hands.
Yes.
You know?
And I have to tell you, and you tell me if you're wrong, I don't talk to anyone, I mean anyone, who thinks, I'm thrilled with what's happening in Washington right now.
Yeah.
No one, right? So I'm just convinced that it has to start to change because the people who are really in charge, the voters, want it to, We just got to have somebody that figures out a recipe for how it can. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys. And thanks to the Dole Institute and the sponsors as well. So we appreciate it. Good to see everybody.